Hello friends, hope you're all doing well. This is going to be a much longer video since it's going to cover gameplay of every unused trial as well as a guide on how to reach them. But before we get into it, could I kindly ask that you subscribe to my channel, as I think it would be really cool if we could get to 500 subscribers before the end of the year. Thank you. So before we actually do get into it, an acknowledgement we have to make is that most of the trials are unfortunately incomplete, and due to this we'll see them at varying degrees of completion, so we'll see more or less of the intended final design. So properties such as enemy spawns, intended characters, and abilities may be missing, so I'll bring in some developer insights and my own speculations to the levels. Getting straight into it then, we've got local files for your game. If you go there, then you can go to Data, Trials, and Layout, and you'll be met by a list of every trial in the game and 10 more. But we don't need this right now, so go back to your Trials folder and open main.trials, which will greet you with all of the in-game trials and parameters set up for them, such as starting items, loot pools, and win conditions. Here you can see some of those parameters, and eventually I'm going to use Ctrl F to search for the final trial, with its arena name being arena_Huntress Imps. The game also recognizes this one as Huntress 2, and it is the only unused trial that has all of the parameters set up for it. Due to this, we don't actually need to edit main.trials to access it, so instead we can open up main.trials_layout, as I will do here. Once open, you'll be met by a list of trial names. Here, I'll simply replace Huntress 1 with Huntress 2, which will swap out Piercing Space and Time with a new trial. As you can see here, there are only 3 Huntress trials in game, yet 4 in total. This is one of the oddities you can look out for when you're looking for new trials. Finally, we can get into the trial, so we just need to open up the game and see the results. And as you can see here, the trial has replaced Piercing Space and Time and has its own trial icon, and this is the only time this will happen. So here I'll fast forward through my first few attempts, so you can see the map layout and such, and in the meantime I'll be giving a bit of insight to this level, so you can figure out what happened with it. In this trial, you'll play as Huntress with your alternate primary, and you'll begin by interacting with an imp shrine, which will summon a total of 100 tiny imps to kill. To succeed, you simply need to kill 60 of the imps within a given time, being 2 minutes. If an imp walks off to the side, it does not count as a kill, so you need to learn an efficient route to get as many as possible before they escape. To get a gold, you still only need 60, but within a stricter time frame of 1 minute and 10 seconds. I spoke to a developer about this trial, and I was informed that the trial was simply not very fun, and even rather annoying at a reoccurring issue in removed features. Another issue was an exploit that could be taken advantage of, which I assume is what I had happen in my gold run, where some imps get stuck behind a geyser, where they'll simply keep jumping and be unable to move anywhere else. Personally, I'd say this trial is quite fun, and it's good at showing off the alternate primary through the pierce. Though the only issue I have with it is its layout, and I guess the developers would agree with me that isn't what they were going for, since another specifically said that they wanted to make a pachinko type level, but didn't have enough custom assets to finally support the idea, which is rather unfortunate, since I can see that being a very fun trial if it was possible. I'll show you the rest of this attempt, and then I'll move on to my gold attempt of this trial. I wouldn't say it was too difficult, but I do understand how there could be frustration with this level. Moving on to the next trial, we have a slightly different method of accessing it, which will be used for all trials from this point on. First off, you need to find the oddity, which is that there are 4 mercenary trials, yet only 3 in-game. From this, we can figure out that one of these is obviously not in-game. But we don't know which one it is, so we'll have to figure that out. If we use Ctrl F, we can search for every mercenary room name we saw in the layout file. So for example, Mercenary Clone, Mercenary Shadow, Mercenary Utility Castle, and Mercenary Parry can all be searched for, and one of them is not going to be in the game. Eventually, I will figure out that it was Mercenary Clone which was not in game, but otherwise I would have not have known. So we do that, and eventually you will see me change Mercenary Shadow to Mercenary Clone. To do that, I simply find the arena_mercenary shadow.raw level, and I change it to Mercenary Clone raw level. So there you go. And now we get to see what it does in-game. Since the trial was eventually replaced by Merc Shadow, we can assume it was probably very similar, with the main difference being map design. There are containers on every side of the map for healing, implying that the trial was probably quite a bit longer than the one we're familiar with now, and that may have contributed to it being removed. Speaking to a developer, I figured out that there was previously an item in this level, which had differing effects based on which way your character faced. So as an example, you might get health regen if you look to the left, and attack speed if you look to the right. This probably would have been unfun to play with, but cool in concept, and it probably resulted in the removal of the trial, and the item as well. There isn't really much else to be said about this trial other than it's quite a lot bigger than the one we're used to now, and there aren't any enemy spawns unfortunately, so we won't be able to learn anything else about this trial. So we'll just move on to the next in a short while. As I've mentioned previously, all trials from this point have a very similar access route. For this trial, we simply need to replicate the same pattern as done with the previous trial. Unfortunately, however, this trial room is named Survival Horror, which doesn't reflect any of the existing trial names. So it's best to assume it was an entirely separate trial that was quickly abandoned. For that reason, when you open your trials.main folder, you can choose any of the trials to replace. In my case, I chose Commando 1, the very starter trial, which would be a colossal feat. To change it, I simply go down to the room path and change it from arena_commando starter to arena_survival_horror. When I do this, it makes it so I get sent to the survival horror room instead of the commando starter room. One issue with this, however, is that it will give me the parameters of the commando trial. So for example, it will have the same loot pools and the same abilities available, as well as the same character, obviously. But there isn't much I can do about that. I could change the parameters, but I don't know what I would change them to, because I don't know enough about this trial, since it was abandoned quite early. Here you can see me attempting to give myself some keycards to bring into the trial, since I've played it before, and I'm aware that there are quite a few locked doors that we can open using keycards that we can't actually get in the trial, outside of cheating them in with starting items. So this is one way you can alter the parameters, but unfortunately I've done it incorrectly, so I don't end out with keycards in the trial, I end out with a test item instead. So you'll see me do this for a few more seconds, and I'll move into the game in a second. As I've mentioned previously, this trial replaces the first Commando trial for me, being a colossal feat. You can see from my items that I have 8 test items instead of 8 keycards which I tried to spawn in. I asked developers about this level, but in the end got no insights, so we'll be going off of my speculations alone for this. But as you can clearly see, the level is just a series of locked doors, items, and interactables, and I've tested it quite a few times. and can confirm the interactables always spawn in the same locations. Also, you may think that the special stock implies that this level was made for Commando, but this isn't the case as the special stock changes based on which character you are. For example, if you were Huntress and picked it up, it would give you an explosive bolt. It would also have the explosive bolt icon, making it really hard to tell which character this level was made for. If I had to guess, this level would have been a timer-based survival as Enforcer because she has a removed secondary that may have perhaps stunned enemies, which helped us to survive longer. Outside of that, it's really hard to say anything about this level. If I wanted to make a fun suggestion, I'd say that there was a removed artifact which added a fog of war to the game, which maybe made this a bit more of a horror experience, having a small area around you visible, and only that. But that's all there is to say about this level, so let's move on to the next. I'll pick up the pace with these sections where I edit the code, since they're all basically the same route as I've mentioned previously. So, moving on to the next trial, we have Arena_Bridge, which immediately made me think of routine maintenance, the despised trial. I assume it would have just been the old map for it, so it wouldn't be too hard to understand what's happening. So, finding arena_maintenance.raw level, I quickly change it to Arena_Bridge, and we can move on to seeing it in-game. I'm aware of the fact that everyone hates this map, so I'll be keeping this one brief. But the first observation you can make is that this map is much smaller than the one we're used to now, with none of the useless items hanging around. Another thing you'll eventually notice is that you can't actually get any drones on kill, and I assume this is just because it's not implemented yet, rather than the way it's meant to be. One detail to note is that previously, a different drone was used for this map instead of the attack speed drone, which was hinted by a developer. You can also see that a different drone was intended for another handy trial, Main Systems Offline, if you read the description for it. I would guess that blast drones were going to be used on this trial previously, since they have a great knockback for pushing enemies off, and because healing drones are used on Main Systems Offline. But that's all there really is to say about this, so let's move on to the next trial. The next trial we'll look at is also a handy trial, being the old map for Main Systems Offline. I didn't expect it to be much different since the name wasn't too different in the files. At best, it could have been the same trial with less features, or perhaps some removed ones, which is exactly what we got. I skipped to my best of 3 attempts because this trial is quite long, and I didn't want to drag out the video too long. So as I've mentioned previously, this trial was meant to feature a different type of drone, which you can find by looking at the description, to be speed drones. If I had to guess, you probably would not have had the Guardian Heart, but instead a bigger health bar, suggested by 2 things. First being the meat nuggets available to the left side in replacement of the ATG that now rests there, as well as a bug that some players had, giving them the incorrect description for the level that didn't give them a Guardian Heart. Enemy spawns may also have been different in later parts of the level, but I never got too far, so I'll just assume that they're about the same, or just mostly unchanged. Aside from that, there really isn't much to say about this level, so I'll just be silent as it plays. For this next trial, I found a 4th Artificer trial, which is meant to replace In the Clouds. This trial is basically complete, since the goal was probably just to kill all the enemies within a certain amount of time. Speaking to a developer about this trial, they said it was just too simple, and perhaps quite boring, albeit funny. It's a simple drop and kill all the enemies. To put it in their words exactly, you drop down to the floor. Trial complete. And ignoring stopwatch, that is definitely the case, since you either kill all of them or die in half a second. Though I will admit, despite this, it was very fun. One thing that's interesting to note is that since we don't have the parameters, we don't know whether or not Ifrit and the Toxic Pig are meant to drop items, or the item pools that they're meant to drop from, since currently they can drop any item in the game. So it's interesting to speculate what items they were meant to drop, or if they were meant to drop items at all. Outside of that though, there isn't really much to talk about for this trial, so I'll just let this final attempt play through before we move on to the next trial. This next trial is Arena_Tree, and unfortunately I don't have any insights for this trial, which is, to be honest, the only way I would have gotten any information about this. But it was just scrapped way too early for me to even guess what this could have been about. So I'll just quickly give you a tour of what we have here. It's just a bunch of vines, some decals for statues in the background, and then a lower platform, and that is it. That's all there is to this trial, so it's impossible to guess who or what this could have been for. So I'll just quickly go on to the next trial. For this next trial, we have Commando 2. A trial I assume was eventually replaced by Commando Bravery, in which you kill an Elder Lemurian using your knife secondary. In this version of the trial, however, there is no such enemy, but instead a set amount of enemies spawn in, and I assume the goal would have been to kill them all within a certain amount of time. When you spawn in, you have 3 Golem drones and a gunner drone, and there are some items scattered around the map. It's a fairly simple trial, but I really do appreciate the flavor that the items bring to it. I'd honestly say that I prefer this over the current version of the map, since it feels much more active than the current version does, where it's just a damage race against the Elder Lemurian. There isn't much else to say about this map, so I'll just be silent and we'll get to the next trial. For the next trial, we have test.rawlevel, which I assume is just meant to be a testing area for developers. I don't have any insight on it, but we can all just assume it's a testing area. Once I entered it, I touched a block which was just hanging out in the open, and I immediately died. I'm not sure why they have a death block there. I'll just guess that they didn't have a menu in the game yet, so they probably had to kill themselves to restart the level or something. Aside from that, there is a lone alien head which you can pick up, and some sort of double blue barrier that doesn't actually do anything, as well as some sort of semi-solid looking hive block that you could just fall through. Aside from that, it doesn't seem as if there's anything, but if you go to the far left, for whatever reason, you spawn in 6 Gotus, and only 6 Gotus. You can't spawn any more than. Picking them all up does nothing interesting, you just run faster as you'd expect. It's interesting to speculate what the developers were doing here. I'd assume that they were testing how speed affects a certain ability, but I'm not sure what ability that may have been. Other than that, it's fairly cool to see that the developers left in their dev room, I guess. It's just a cool area to look at. Aside from that, there isn't really much to say about it, so we'll get on to the next trial in a second. Moving on to our 10th and final trial, we have a very strangely named one, called Prov Finale Art Prototype. I'm not sure what I was expecting here, but it was definitely not a crash that I was met with. But that gives us a good point to end off the video, so I hope you all enjoyed, and perhaps learnt something about the game. Thank you so very much, and please consider subscribing. Bye friends.